Flames, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by McConnell. Sometimes when people ask my name, I find it a little hard to know which one to give. My real name, the one that was on my birth certificate, was Leonard Merlode, though that's probably the one I use least, if I'm honest. Online, I mostly go by Magic Merlin, and in some groups just Mage171. At work, they just used to call me Merle. When I had, proper work. For a long time, I was a research scientist working in technology development for a major games company. I was good, too, even if I do say so myself. I could probably sit beside 90% of gamers sitting down at a console tonight, and unless they're properly retro and playing something like World Cup Italia 90 on a beat-up Sega Mega Drive, I could tell them at least 5 things, from their gameplay experience to the graphics to the actual processing responsible for their games, that I, personally, worked on or developed myself. For a brief moment there, I was a bit of a legend. In the last years at my job, I sort of worked for myself. I'd outgrown the whole having a boss who gives you assignments kind of thing. It was getting kind of boring. I could never make that model stick. By the time the people upstairs had decided what they wanted me working on next, I was already 5 steps ahead working on something entirely different, which was never good. I work quickly, and I lose interest quickly. Unless the project excites me, the results aren't going to be good, and in those kind of jobs I felt like I was getting stuck on stuff, or buried under projects that should have died a death years earlier. For the work to be good, I have to feel it. When I'm interested, when I have a reason or an inspiration, that's when I work best. So, instead of a boss, I had my own workshops. In my workshops, I could work on my own stuff, develop whatever technology or idea took my interest, and then, when it was ready to be shown to the world, I could approach all the major companies, show them what I had, and let them fight over the end product. Eventually, I'd sell it to the highest bidder, by which time it would be in the hands of my lawyers, and I'd have moved on to some entirely different project. Working like that was perfect for me, until I said no to the wrong people. That was when they sent decks. After that, after seeing one of my workshops and half my life's work go up in smoke, not to mention what came after, well, I kind of lost the drive for it. Plus, of course, there were other projects occupying my time. To start, though, I should probably explain a few things. For example, it would probably be good for you to know who Dex is and what he did for a living. It would probably also be good for you to know exactly who I said no to and why. Context, I feel, is always important, particularly in a confession, which I suppose in some ways this is. Part confession, part status report, but definitely more confession. Dexter Lorraine is the man that those who know enough to know why call Flames. For most people, he is known simply as Dex. For much of his early life, Dexter was in the military and indeed was well respected for his abilities. After leaving the military, he got a job working for a chemical company. Observed from the outside, by anyone who had the care to pay enough attention, this would have looked suspicious. My grandfather used to say that jobs could be divided into 2 categories, those that pay you from the neck up and those that pay you from the neck down. Considering his background and abilities, Dex's choice of category seemed a little odd. During his service, Dex had been a munitions expert, a job that required detailed information, accurate processing, and a whole heap of critical thinking under pressure. He had a background in chemical engineering and a degree from a prestigious university. Whilst the company he eventually worked for after leaving the service was a well-known and widely respected one, Dex's position within the company wasn't. The job he did day to day was very much a fetch me, carry me, labor-based job, a job that required him to deliver orders and move barrels, basically humping stuff from one location and then humping them onto a van in another. Whilst I have never been one to condescend to any job or to judge people by what they choose to do, I'm a coder at heart. For me, a chain is only a chain if every link is equally as important. It would be fair to say that it was a job for which Dex seemed massively overqualified and perhaps not entirely suited. Again, it was a choice that may have raised eyebrows, had anyone's eyebrows actually been focused on Dex in the first place. But of course, they weren't. You can't connect the dots when you don't know the dots exist. That was the way Dex liked it. In retrospect, with 2020 clarity afforded by hindsight, we would of course look with some suspicion at the fact that mercenary groups in the Congo and terrorist organizations on 3 different continents had chemicals that could be traced back not only to the company that Dex worked for, but also to the exact plant and, in some cases, the exact depot he was in charge of. Had they been looking at the time, authorities may have been interested in the quantities of chemicals that were reported missing from these plants and depots. They might have been interested in the inconsistencies between the records of quantities going in and those coming out, and how, coincidentally, these happened to be the same sorts of chemicals used to process cocaine and other narcotics, not to mention to make explosives. They might have been interested, but they weren't. Only I was, and only then, in retrospect. Even then, these details don't come close to being the most interesting aspects of Dex's work. That title is reserved for the fires. They didn't call him Flames for nothing. I am not very often what one would consider a hacker. I know how to do it, and in fact do it very well, but it's just not my thing. It's a useful tool to have if ever you want to find things out that someone else doesn't want you to know, but it isn't something I like doing, and I'm certainly not in league with any of those political hacking groups. To me, those guys always seem to be driven more by ego or some misguided sense of anarchy than anything else. Sabotage, industrial espionage, and vandalism are all things I abhor, and coincidentally things that most hackers enjoy, so I try to stay out of it. I did, however, hack the mainframe servers of the Central Police Network a few years ago. Not because I wanted to disrupt anything, but because I wanted some information. You see, for me, disruption is the exact opposite of what I wanted. To me, a good hack involves being incredibly quiet and imperceptible. You wouldn't break into someone's home whilst beating a bass drum or leaving massive footprints everywhere, would you? So why would you do that when you break into someone's computer? My preference is to get in as quietly as possible, get what I need, and get out before anyone notices, usually leaving a small hidden entrance for myself in case I ever want to go back. In the case of my research on Dex, nobody noticed, most likely because the type of things I was looking for were in entirely separate and unrelated files, in different departments, and spread over years. As I said earlier, you don't connect the dots if you don't know they're there. I had begun to connect them. First, though, we should take a trip back in time. In 2015, I was working on revolutionary technology. The idea had come to me a few years earlier whilst talking to my girlfriend over a Skype chat. Things had started to get a little bit raunchy, and she had happened to say, "I wish I could feel you." That was all it took. In a flash of an instant, I saw the whole thing, the blueprint, the application, the mechanics necessary, the coding it would take to produce it. The conversation itself took place in 2012. It took me 3 years to make what I saw in my mind's eye come to life in the real world, but in essence, the entire thing was born, constructed, and completed in a few seconds, right there in my bedroom. It was already real to me. It already existed in this world because it existed in my mind. It was just set to private for a while whilst it was still in my head. All I had to do was get it out of my head and into the physical world so other people could see it and use it. My ideas are always like that. I called it Vlesh, virtual flesh. That first night when I saw it in my head, I even saw the box it would come in, the logo with a huge neon V and the rest of the word in jagged angular print. To explain, Vlesh was to be a suit of sorts. Basically, it would be worn a little like armor. Think of it a little like a wetsuit that divers wear, but instead of being constructed from rubber, it would be made up of several hundred small patches of synthetically produced skin, like the ear grown on the back of a mouse in that weird experiment, and something similar to the vegan impossible meats that my girlfriend loves to eat instead of steak. The outside of the Vlesh suit looked like bleached white skin, whilst the inside was lined with hundreds upon hundreds of microscopic sensors that pressed against the wearer's actual skin. There would then be a gauge for the wearer to decide what level of intensity they required, how much, in essence, they wanted to feel. Because the idea of the Vlesh suit was to mimic the experience of skin without actually damaging the wearer, the synthetic flesh would be sensitive to pressure, temperature, and damage encoded by the game or the virtual environment. By being linked to the wearer's own skin, it would send messages to the brain and make the wearer feel as if whatever were happening to the Vlesh was happening to them. If in the game I sent the person to the Arctic naked, they would feel the cold, experience the sensations of getting frostbite, whilst their own skin and body remained entirely intact and unaffected. Vlesh allowed them to feel the game. It was going to be so cool. For example, if you were playing a beat-em-up or boxing game against a friend who was in another state or even another country, you could both wear your Vlesh suits, agree on a level of sensitivity, and when you fought, throwing virtual punches or kicks in the simulated environment, you would feel the blows as if they were actually landing. Combined with virtual reality, the experience would be like having a second body. As for lovers, well, even if separated, the experience of touch between two people could be simulated. If you did it in there, you'd feel it out here. It took me 3 years, but my girlfriend would get her wish in the end. Obviously, each game or virtual environment would need to have its own built-in levels and limiters, so that, for example, if you were playing some kind of war game and you were shot, the pain would not be even close to the actual experience of being shot, but would make the wearer more than aware that they had been tagged. The problem with the technology was, it was too good. Without limiters, the experience would be exactly like being shot. Sometimes the brain, unable to distinguish between what was real and what was fabricated, would make the body react. Yes, the suit could be removed, the simulation stopped, and the instant the virtual experience ended, the physical experiences would end too, but in the meantime, well, the wearer could go into shock or be psychologically damaged. Whilst I could see that there might be some benefit in a system that could simulate physical touch and get kids playing war games out of the mindset that shooting people is an inconsequential act, by letting them feel at least a fraction of what it might be like, I didn't like the idea of people having their own control over that technology. There had to be a way to install limits that were less than what would be experienced in reality, just to protect people. Of course, installing limiters from the start might make it less marketable. I could see how professional athletes might want to turn their physical experiences right up to mimic the feeling of actual competition on a skin they could then take off at the end of the session, allowing them far quicker recovery time. But I never imagined there would be a market or application for a system that could accurately mimic the experience of being shot without actually damaging the skin. Until I got the call. The man said he was a general and pronounced his name as if I should have heard of him. Of course I hadn't. He explained that they had gotten wind of my little experiments and wanted to offer me an astronomical sum to share the technology. To his credit, when I asked what they wanted to use the technology for, he didn't sugarcoat it. He explained that they intended to use the technology for training purposes. If you could send someone into combat and have them experience all the environmental circumstances without actually being there, that is brilliant training. If soldiers could be shot on screen and feel what it's like to be shot for real with no lasting consequences, that would provide excellent training. Not only by giving them an idea of what to expect, but by making them even less keen to take the hit in practice. The threat of actually feeling the bullet would drive them to be better, move faster, and react quicker, thereby making better soldiers. It would also allow the military to subject trainees to simulated environments with intense and even dangerous conditions or extremes without actually endangering them. They would actually feel the pain as if they were there, but as soon as someone hit the off switch, the pain would stop. The session would be over, and they could come back to repeat the session and correct their mistakes the following day. It sounded extreme. even outrageous. But I could understand the logic. In principle, although the ethics were highly questionable, it wasn't completely abhorrent. What was abhorrent was the potential. The fact that if I signed over the technology for military use, they could adapt it, reverse engineer it, and extend its capabilities without the need for my approval or moral guidance. If, for example, they wanted to place a captive or opposition fighter in the Vlesh suit, they could crank the dial up as far as they wanted, even exceeding the sensitivity that the skin actually has, so that even the lightest touch in the virtual world would become painful. They could develop programs and simulations that had nothing to do with training, but instead became virtual torture chambers, where they could subject their victims to untold levels of pain and agony for as long as they wished, either to extract confessions or information, or simply to punish or harm them. I worried that being able to release the victim, who would have experienced being shot 50 times, stabbed or electrocuted over and over, and show them entirely unscathed afterwards, would erase all evidence of war crimes. The ability to show the victim without a cut or bruise on their body would lead to too much temptation. I also wondered whether the definitions of torture in things like the Geneva Convention and Bills of Human Rights would legislate for this technology. Would simulated torture count, or would that be a loophole? I was sure that if this did happen, the legal definition would be changed to accommodate treatment in a Vlesh suit in time. But until then? It should be clear that there was no suggestion during our meeting that this avenue would be explored, but still, the idea had taken root. The possibility was real that the technology could be exploited in that way. So, I said no, and they sent Dex. For whilst no government official ever stated that they would pursue that possibility, it didn't mean they hadn't thought of it, either for their own use or as a potential threat. When I said that I would not let them use the technology, would not sell it to them at any price, the technology transitioned from the former to the latter. If it was not being used by them, then it was a threat, because it could be potentially used by others. The General explained as much to me and highlighted with special emphasis how the government would find that prospect very concerning. I tried to explain that I could build limiters into the technology, but he seemed unconvinced. In his mind, if I could figure out how to limit the technology, someone else could figure out how to unpick my work and unlimit it. He asked again, giving me, he said, a final chance to reconsider. When I said no, yet again, he elevated the government's stance to gravely concerned. It was at this point that another man, who had somehow managed to let himself in, entirely uninvited, strolled casually over and joined the General in our meeting. At first, I assumed him to be a driver or some lackey for the General's day-to-day operations, but after whispering something in the General's ear, he turned to face me directly and spoke. "I think you really need to reconsider your decision. The thing about organizations like the military is that they don't like to be told no. I'm going to give you one last chance, or you are going to seriously regret it." Later, I would hear the General refer to him as Dex, but at the time I had no idea who this man was. In contrast to the General, he was wearing civilian clothes and looked, if I'm honest, a little shabby by comparison. "Is that a threat?" I asked bluntly, somewhat taken aback by the bold ferocity of his words. "No," he said quietly, before taking a step closer so that we were almost nose to nose, and I could smell the stench of stale cigarettes on his breath. "It is a statement of fact, cold, hard fact, that you would do well to take heed of." I smiled, attempting to show that I was not scared, though I could feel myself trembling. The shabby man looked me up and down and smiled, a cold crocodilian smile, before touching the General on the shoulder, nodding and bidding me a good day, knowing full well, I believe, that my day was about to be far from good. The explosion that tore through my workshop was not simulated. It was as real as could be, and threw me to the ground with such force that I broke my collarbone and chipped bones in my shoulder. Struggling to my feet, I saw the entire back wall of the warehouse missing, and sprinted for the door, just in time to see a massive fireball consume most of the left side of the workshop. It is unbelievable to me that fire of that size, of such an enormous scale, was not attended by fire services until over an hour later. Apparently there had been roadblocks with concrete barricades set up in the roads surrounding the property, though no agency ever claimed responsibility for putting them up. After calling the fire department, I immediately tried to call my friends and colleagues at the other workshops I had set up around the country. There were 7 in total. As it happened, I never got past the call to the first. I tried the registered number of the workshop and received no reply. Fearing the worst, I tried a mobile number, the number of the phone belonging to Padma, my girlfriend, who worked at the second site. Again, there was no answer. I made further phone calls, inquiring with surrounding businesses, with police departments in the area, until finally I received news that the building had gone up in flames. It was 4 hours later that I received a call to say that 6 bodies had been recovered at the second site, 4 from the third, and so on. In total, 18 of my closest friends and colleagues were killed. My entire life's work, not only on this project, but on innumerable others, appeared to have gone up in flames. I did not attend the funerals. For even then I knew. After making the phone calls that informed me about my friends and workshops, I ran. I dropped the phone, though I knew it was encrypted and untraceable, into the drain, and retreated to a nearby car parking lot, where I remained for almost 2 days, hunched in a corner of the upper floor. I spent the time writhing in pain, starving, and looking out as if from a concrete watchtower as firefighters tried to battle the flames. My shoulder and chest were killing me, but I knew that was a problem that would have to wait, just as I would have to wait also. I did, and eventually my patience was rewarded. At around 4 a.m. on the second day, an expensive-looking black car pulled up beside the still smouldering ashes of my workshop. 2 men, whom I recognized as the General and his shabby friend Dex, ducked under the barriers and tape that had been set up around the site and casually strolled onto the blackened landscape. Using metal rods, they picked and sifted through the remnants. I knew what they were looking for. They had intentionally destroyed the technology, so they were not searching for that. Rather, they were looking for evidence of the other things they had destroyed, namely, me. Though I was starving and thirsty, I waited another 4 hours after the pair left to sneak out from the car park. I am not proud to say that I stole a car, drove to some nearby woods, set the car alight, and then made my way on foot to the bunker where I knew I would be safe. I had set the bunker up years earlier. It was within a mile of the main workshop. It was located in a patch of woodland, on land that had been purchased in Padma's mother's name, a precaution I had taken to stop people linking the place directly to me. From the outside, it looked just like a piece of wasteland, scattered with trees. Below the surface, however, accessed via a well-concealed trapdoor, there was a veritable nerve center. I have been living in the bunker ever since. I have a water supply and food is delivered to nearby locations via a network of friends and colleagues I correspond with securely online. It was from here that I learned that I had been recorded as dead. I had no family other than Padma, but if I had, they would have been told that I died in a tragic fire. No mention was made of the coincidental fact that many of my other workshops burnt down on the same day, or that people close to me, people I loved, perished in those fires. It was also from the bunker that I learned more about Dex. Over the past 15 years, there have been over 100 massive fires in this country that firefighters have chalked up as suspected arson, but which they have been unable to prove a cause for. One article that I found on the dark web posited the theory that these fires, all of which somehow financially benefited people already rich enough that they did not need to financially benefit, could have been started by the same solo arsonist, perhaps as paid work. By accessing the police and fire department computers, I was able to access the records and site analysis of all these fires and to trace the similarities and connections between them, dots that had not been previously connected. In every case, the source of the fire seemed to come from the same pattern of multiple start points. In every case, Chemical residue was found in the buildings, chemicals that matched those stores at the chemical works where Dex found employment. By tracing the owners of these buildings and holdings companies, I was able to identify links that had not been previously made between them. For example, how closely 4 of the men worked with each other, all being members on the boards of each other's companies, or the fact that 2 of them signed over ownership of their property to the others just weeks before their individual and entirely unrelated fires, meaning that they would never be suspected of having set or ordered the fires at places they owned that would pay out masses of insurance damages. It was a network and a web, and at the center of it, the plump spider in the shabby clothes, Dex. It took me a month, scouring through the emails between this clan of crooks who had clearly orchestrated the burning of their properties for high insurance gains before I finally found references to a man named Dex. As I began to piece together the references, I found his chemical-covered fingerprints on over 90 of the fires. Dex, it appeared, was an arsonist for hire, a man with enough knowledge of combustion and how to go about creating a structured conflagration to avoid any evidence of arson. He would burn down any and every structure you paid him to, whilst also ensuring that the authorities would never be able to prove that you had anything to do with it. In my searches, I found warehouses, office blocks containing sensitive documents, a solicitor's office, and even a police station where, conveniently, the evidence rooms storing samples that were to be used in a high-profile case a month later were stored, all razed to the ground. Whilst this might sound bad enough, the picture became even darker when you factored in the fires that claimed the lives of several well-known gang leaders. All were separate incidents, but the elimination of these rivals all seemed, coincidentally, to benefit one surviving gang leader in particular. Then there were the husbands who claimed massive payouts on the life insurance of wives who had tragically perished in house fires. The husbands, of course, had a concrete alibi and couldn't possibly have been involved, but of course, Dex could. In at least 2 cases, the fire had not only removed the husband's tiresome wife, but had also left him able to enjoy his newfound wealth without the demands of looking after children. Dex's day job was, quite clearly, a cover that allowed him easy access to the materials he needed for his real trade. How these sinister elements under whose employ he did his real work found him, I still have no clue. With much of his work going on in the days before every action left a digital footprint, his early efforts are hard to trace, but I can say with absolute confidence that Dex is personally responsible for the death of at least 50 individuals, all of whom burned to death, all of whom were innocent, and some of whom were my friends. Held against a record like this, my crimes seem wholly insignificant. I haven't killed anyone. But then, that's kind of the point. I found Dex early last year. It took me a while to hack the phones of his contacts and eventually link to his personal phone. After that, using the GPS and his bank records, it was easy to monitor his movements, and I bided my time, waiting for the right moment. It seemed fitting, considering where I had spent the night after he burnt my dreams to ashes, that our next fateful meeting should be in a car park. The tranquilizer went in without a sound, and other than the wet thud as Dex's head hit the concrete, there was no noise at all. I can say now, with absolute confidence, that Vlesh will never be released to the general market. Not because it was destroyed in the fire, but because in the time since the fire, I have seen exactly what it is capable of. Having repaired and refitted some of the prototypes that I kept in the bunker, I spent many months developing a very special environment for my good friend Dex. You see, not only is the technology capable of simulating agonizing pain, making the wearer feel exactly as if they were being, just for example, roasted alive, but it has the additional property of never actually receiving any damage or deteriorating, meaning that as long as the wearer's actual nerves are given adequate time to recover, they can have the same excruciating experience over and over for as long as the person inflicting the treatment wants it to go on for. Obviously, For that kind of thing to happen in real life, the person inflicting the pain would have to be truly heartless, or at least deeply, deeply vengeful. Dex has been my guest for almost 9 months now. He is strung up in my bunker, wearing the Vlesh suit and fed through a tube. On his head is a VR headset, and in his mouth a ball gag. For every day of these 9 months, he has experienced the same scenario over and over again, and so he will until I get bored. I'm sure it will happen. At some point, torturing him will get old, and I'll lose interest and move on to some new project. But for now, Dex will be kept alive in my bunker, where, to my unceasing delight, he will burn and burn and burn. This has been Flames, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2021 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.